October 1944. When German soldiers retook the small village of Nemmersdorf, they found something that would send shockwaves of absolute terror through every German woman from Berlin to Bavaria. Bodies of women, some as young as 8, others as old as 80, nailed to barn doors. What the Red Army did in that tiny village was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume millions. This is the story that was buried for decades, the story of what happened when vengeance came knocking. Winter was closing in on Berlin, and Helga Schmidt could feel it in her bones. At 24, she had spent 3 years as a nurse in the city's overwhelmed hospitals, patching up soldiers who arrived with increasingly haunted looks in their eyes. But lately, those soldiers brought something worse than their wounds. They brought whispers. Whispers about Nemmersdorf. The official Nazi propaganda machine had initially tried to use the massacre for their own purposes, publishing photographs that were quickly pulled when the regime realized the images were causing mass panic instead of fighting spirit. What happened in that East Prussian village in October 1944 was simple and brutal. When Soviet forces briefly captured it before being pushed back, they left behind 72 bodies, women and girls, violated and murdered. The methods were so horrific that even hardened Wehrmacht soldiers vomited at the scene. Helga first heard about it from a sergeant who wouldn't stop shaking. He sat in her hospital ward, physically uninjured but mentally shattered, describing what he had witnessed during the German counteroffensive. Women crucified on barn doors, mothers killed alongside their children. The youngest victim was 8 years old. The oldest was 84. What united them was their gender and their nationality. They were German women, and that was enough. The sergeant whispered something that would haunt Helga forever. The Soviets are coming, and hell is coming with them. Every woman in Germany needs to run west, run towards the Americans, the British, anyone but the Red Army. 300 miles away in the rural expanse of East Prussia, Ingrid Weber was already running. At 38, with 3 children clinging to her as they fled through frozen fields, she represented millions of German civilians who were beginning the largest exodus in European history. Her husband had died at Stalingrad. Her oldest son, barely 16, had been conscripted 3 months ago. She had no idea if he was alive. All she knew was that the Red Army was advancing, and every refugee streaming westward carried the same stories. The roads were clogged with humanity fleeing in terror. Horse-drawn carts, baby carriages loaded with possessions, elderly people being pushed in wheelbarrows. And everywhere, the fear was palpable. Ingrid watched as women threw away their jewelry, cut their hair short, rubbed dirt on their faces, anything to make themselves less noticeable. Some mothers were making their teenage daughters dress as boys. Everyone had heard what happened to the women who didn't make it out in time. The stories spreading through the refugee columns were consistent and horrifying. When the Red Army took Goldap, another East Prussian town, they systematically went house to house. Women from 8 to 80 were targeted. Nuns in a convent were not spared. The pattern was clear, deliberate, and widespread. This was not the action of rogue soldiers. This was sanctioned, encouraged, weaponized violence. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman, who traveled with the Red Army, would later write in his private journals about what he witnessed. He described a systematic campaign of revenge, officers turning blind eyes, soldiers motivated by a toxic mixture of propaganda, vodka, and rage over what Germany had done to the Soviet Union. The Nazi invasion had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Now the bill was coming due, and German women were the currency. Ingrid made it to a temporary refugee camp near Danzig, where thousands huddled in the bitter January cold of 1945. Here she met other women with worse stories. A teenager who had escaped Gumbinnen described how Soviet soldiers lined up outside buildings where women were kept, waiting their turns like it was a military operation. An elderly woman from Marienburg had witnessed her own daughters subjected to attacks that lasted for days. The woman's eyes were empty as she spoke, as if her soul had already departed. The contrast with the Western allies was stark and deliberate among the refugees. Everyone was trying to reach the American or British lines. Women who made it to Western zones reported that while the occupation was not perfect, it was fundamentally different. American soldiers were court-martialed for assaults. British military police enforced strict conduct codes. There were violations, yes, but they were treated as crimes, not policy. In the Soviet zone, there was no protection, no justice, no hope. Back in Berlin, Liesel Hoffmann sat in her small apartment with her diary, a dangerous possession in those final months of the Reich. At 31, she was a schoolteacher who had watched her city prepare for the inevitable. Liesel had been secretly documenting everything since 1943, creating a record that would become invaluable to historians decades later. In January 1945, she wrote about the conversations among Berlin's women. They were preparing for the worst. Her neighbor, Frau Schneider, had acquired cyanide capsules, one for herself and one for her daughter. Another woman on her floor had a small pistol hidden beneath a loose floorboard. These were not acts of cowardice but of desperate calculation. Women across Berlin were making impossible decisions about what fate might be worse than death. The answer, for many, was what awaited them when the Red Army arrived. The Nazi leadership knew what was coming. In late January 1945, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels gave a speech that inadvertently confirmed everyone's worst fears. He spoke of the need to defend German womanhood from Asiatic hordes, using racist language to describe Soviet soldiers. But his words backfired. Instead of inspiring resistance, they increased panic. If even Goebbels was this scared, how bad would it really be? The answer came in April 1945. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16th, with a Soviet force of over 2 million soldiers encircling the city. Helga was working double shifts at the hospital when the first artillery shells began falling. Within days, the Red Army was in the suburbs. Within 2 weeks, they were everywhere. What followed was chronicled by multiple sources, including the anonymous diary that would later be published as A Woman in Berlin by journalist Marta Hillers. Her account, along with thousands of others, painted a consistent picture. When Soviet soldiers entered Berlin, they went building to building, apartment to apartment, searching for women. Age was largely irrelevant. The attacks were so widespread that it became not a question of if, but when and how many times. Helga's hospital was captured on April 24th. She and the other nurses were told by the head physician, Dr. Klaus Bauer, to hide in the basement. The elderly doctor, one of the few men left, tried to negotiate with the Soviet soldiers who stormed in. He explained that this was a medical facility, protected under international law, that the women here were medical staff, not combatants. He was pushed aside and told to shut up or be shot. What happened in that basement over the next 3 days was something Helga would never speak about publicly for the rest of her life. When researchers finally interviewed her in the 1990s, decades after the events, she could only say that she survived by dissociating completely, pretending she was somewhere else, someone else. 2 of her fellow nurses did not survive. One died from internal injuries. The other took her own life when the soldiers finally left. Across Berlin, the pattern repeated in thousands of locations. Liesel documented it in her diary with clinical detachment, perhaps the only way to process the horror. She wrote about women being dragged from their hiding places behind false walls. She wrote about mothers attacked in front of their children. She wrote about girls as young as 12 and women as old as 70. She wrote about how some women, in desperate attempts at survival, sought out individual Soviet officers to become their temporary property, calculating that one protector might be better than facing dozens of assailants. The Soviet command structure's role in this catastrophe cannot be ignored. While some officers tried to maintain discipline, many did not. Soviet propagandist Ilya Ehrenberg had published inflammatory articles encouraging soldiers to break the pride of German women. Although he later claimed his words were misinterpreted, the damage was done. Soviet soldiers arrived in Germany with official sanction to take revenge, and women became the primary targets of that revenge. Stalin himself knew what was happening. When Yugoslav communist Milovan Djilas complained to him about the behavior of Soviet soldiers, Stalin famously replied, "Can't you understand it if a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman, or takes some trifle?" This dismissive attitude from the very top ensured that there would be no meaningful attempt to stop the violence. The statistics are staggering and deeply contested, but multiple historians and demographic studies have converged on estimates. In Berlin alone, approximately 95,000 to 130,000 women were assaulted. Across the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, the number reaches into the millions. Dr. Philip Kuert's 2010 study of elderly German women found that approximately 1 in 4 who lived through the Soviet occupation experienced sexual violence. The actual number is likely higher, as many never spoke about their experiences. Ingrid Weber eventually made it to Berlin, fleeing from one danger into another. By the time she arrived in early May, the fighting was over, but the chaos continued. She found temporary shelter in a bombed-out apartment building where she met other refugee women. They shared survival strategies and whispered conversations. Stay in groups if possible. Keep children hidden and quiet. If soldiers come, don't resist or they'll be more violent. Try to find food in the morning when soldiers are less likely to be drunk. These were the grim calculations of occupied Berlin. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Many women developed severe trauma responses that would last for decades. Some dissociated so completely that they had incomplete memories of entire weeks or months. Others became emotionally numb, unable to form close relationships for years afterward. Suicide rates among German women spiked dramatically. In Berlin alone, an estimated 3,000 women took their own lives in the spring and summer of 1945. Dr. Klaus Bauer tried to help where he could. Working in the ruins of his hospital, he treated hundreds of women for physical injuries that spoke of horrific violence. He documented torn tissue, broken bones, infections, and unwanted pregnancies. His medical records, preserved in archives, provide clinical evidence of the scale of the violence. He estimated that at least 60% of women he treated between April and August 1945 showed signs of sexual assault. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this tragedy was what came after the violence itself: the silence. When Germany was divided into occupation zones, the Soviet-controlled East German government absolutely forbade any discussion of what had happened. Women who tried to speak out were silenced, sometimes violently. The official communist narrative was that the Red Army were liberators, and any suggestion otherwise was considered fascist propaganda and treated as a crime. Even in West Germany, the topic was taboo for decades. German society, struggling to process its own guilt over the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities, was not ready to address the suffering of German women. When the anonymous diary A Woman in Berlin was first published in 1954, it was met with harsh criticism in Germany. Critics accused the author of sullying the honor of German women and making Germans look like victims when they were perpetrators. The book was not republished in Germany until 2003, nearly 50 years later. Helga eventually left Berlin when it became possible to move to the American sector. She never married, never had children, never spoke publicly about her experiences until historians tracked her down in the 1990s when she was in her 70s. Even then, her testimony was brief and pained. She said that the worst part was not the violence itself, but the decades of silence afterward, the feeling that her suffering didn't matter, that it was somehow justified or deserved because of what Germany had done. She wanted history to know that war creates victims in ways people don't want to acknowledge. Ingrid Weber survived and eventually remarried, moving to West Germany in 1950. She had nightmares for the rest of her life. Her daughter, interviewed years later, said her mother would sometimes wake up screaming, and that there were certain sounds or situations that would cause her to freeze completely, transported back to 1945. Ingrid never told her new husband or her children the full truth of what happened in those months. The trauma was passed down through her family in the form of unexplained fears and behaviors that made sense only when the historical context was revealed. Liesl Hoffmann's diary survived the war and was eventually donated to a historical archive. It stands as one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of occupied Berlin. Liesl herself became a teacher again in West Berlin, dedicating her life to educating young people about the full truth of war, not just the battles and politics, but the human cost. She argued that understanding this history was essential to preventing it from ever happening again. The women of Nemmersdorf, where this nightmare began, were never forgotten by those who survived. The village became a symbol of what German women feared most, and those fears proved entirely justified. Memorials would eventually be erected, but for decades the story was suppressed in East Germany and ignored in the West. Only with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of archives did researchers begin to fully document what had occurred. Modern historians grapple with how to tell this story responsibly. It exists in a difficult space where acknowledging German suffering can be misused to minimize German guilt for Nazi atrocities. The reality is that both things are true. Germany under Hitler committed unprecedented evil, genocide on an industrial scale, launching a war of annihilation that killed tens of millions. And German women, most of whom had no say in their government's policies, suffered terribly when vengeance came. These facts do not cancel each other out. They coexist as twin tragedies of a catastrophic war. Soviet motivations were complex. Many Red Army soldiers had witnessed unspeakable atrocities in their homeland. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was explicitly genocidal, with orders to starve and enslave the population. Soviet soldiers had seen their villages burned, their families murdered, their country devastated. When they entered Germany, they brought that rage with them. But rage, however understandable, does not justify what occurred. The women of Berlin had not burned Soviet villages. The 8-year-old girl in Nemmersdorf had not killed Soviet civilians. They suffered for crimes they did not commit. The contrast with Western Allied occupation became even more apparent as time went on. In American and British zones, German women faced hardship, hunger, and displacement, but they were protected by military justice systems that treated assaults as serious crimes. There were violations, and historians have documented them, but they numbered in the hundreds, not the hundreds of thousands. German women in the Western zones knew they were comparatively fortunate, which created its own complicated feelings. As the Cold War began, the suffering of German women became a propaganda tool. West Germany used it to paint the Soviet Union as barbaric. The Soviet Union denied it happened and accused the West of fabricating stories. East Germany was caught in the middle, forced to silence its own citizens to maintain loyalty to Moscow. Women who had experienced the horrors were told they were lying or misremembering, that they were traitors for speaking negatively about the glorious Red Army. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of communism, that serious historical research could be conducted. Historians like Antony Beevor, in his book The Fall of Berlin, 1945, used newly opened Soviet archives and interviewed survivors to document the scale of the violence. His work faced criticism from Russian authorities who accused him of Russophobia, but his findings have been corroborated by multiple other researchers, including German and Russian historians willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Medical records from the period provide stark evidence. Hospitals in Berlin treated thousands of women for injuries consistent with sexual assault between April and December 1945. Abortion requests spiked dramatically, with estimates suggesting as many as 10,000 pregnancies resulted from the violence in Berlin alone. Many of these pregnancies were terminated in dangerous illegal procedures, as official channels were overwhelmed. Some women gave birth to children they struggled to love, innocent victims of terrible circumstances. The children born from these encounters faced their own tragedies. Called Russenkinder or Russian children, they grew up knowing the circumstances of their conception or sensing the complicated feelings their mothers had toward them. Some were given up for adoption. Others were raised in difficult circumstances, their existence a constant reminder of trauma. These children, now elderly adults, have their own complex relationships with this history. Dr. Bauer continued working in Berlin throughout the occupation, documenting what he saw with clinical precision. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1968, provide a physician's perspective on the medical crisis. He wrote about the impossibility of providing adequate care with limited supplies, about women who came to him too traumatized to speak, about his own feelings of helplessness and rage. He wrote that he had survived World War I, practiced medicine through the Nazi period, and thought he had seen the worst of humanity. He was wrong. The Red Army's behavior in Germany was not unique to German victims. As Soviet forces advanced through Eastern Europe, similar patterns of violence occurred in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and elsewhere. Soviet soldiers saw all enemy territory as fair game, but the scale and systematic nature of what happened in Germany was unprecedented, driven by propaganda, poor discipline, and a desire for revenge against the nation that had invaded the Soviet homeland. Understanding the Soviet perspective is important for historical completeness. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union had been apocalyptic. Entire cities were besieged and starved. Leningrad lost over 1 million civilians to starvation during the Nazi siege. In Belarus, 1 in 4 people died. Nazi Einsatzgruppen murdered millions of Jews, communists, and civilians in mass shootings. Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved to death by the millions. When the Red Army finally turned the tide and began advancing toward Germany, soldiers had witnessed or experienced horrors that broke something fundamental in their understanding of humanity. Soviet military leadership failed to channel this trauma into anything resembling discipline. Instead, they let it explode outward. Orders were issued about maintaining discipline, but they were rarely enforced. Officers who tried to protect civilians were often overruled or ignored. The message from the top was clear enough. What happens in Germany stays in Germany. This catastrophic failure of military justice turned soldiers into perpetrators and ensured that the cycle of violence continued. For the women who survived, the question of how to move forward was agonizing. Some, like Helga, chose isolation and silence. Others, like Liesel, chose to document and educate. Still others tried to simply forget, to bury the memories so deep they might never surface. But trauma does not work that way. It emerged in nightmares, in panic attacks triggered by innocuous sounds, in an inability to trust, in relationships that could never quite form properly. The psychological impact extended beyond the direct victims. Daughters and granddaughters of survivors often grew up in households marked by unspoken trauma. Researchers have found evidence of intergenerational trauma transmission, where the effects of extreme experiences impact subsequent generations even when the original events are never discussed. Anxiety, depression, and attachment issues appeared in families where the root cause was hidden decades in the past. German society's reckoning with this history has been slow and incomplete. It was not until the 2000s that major documentaries and books really brought the topic into mainstream discussion. The 2008 film Anonyma, based on a woman in Berlin, sparked new conversations. Survivors, now elderly, began speaking out, feeling that they had little left to lose. Their testimonies added crucial detail to the historical record. Russian acknowledgement has been even more limited. While some Russian historians have honestly addressed what occurred, official Russian narratives often downplay or deny the scale of the violence. This is partly Cold War legacy and partly contemporary politics, as Russia seeks to maintain the narrative of the Great Patriotic War as purely heroic. Admitting widespread atrocities by the Red Army complicates that narrative in ways the Russian government finds unacceptable. The women of 1945 are now nearly all gone. Helga Schmidt died in 2005 at age 84. Ingrid Weber passed in 1998. Liesel Hoffmann lived until 2012, giving her last interview at age 98. Their stories, and the stories of millions like them, are now primarily preserved in archives, interviews, and historical research. The last living witnesses are in their late 80s and 90s, and soon there will be no one left who remembers firsthand. What should we take from this history? First, that war creates cascading horrors that extend far beyond battlefields. Second, that sexual violence as a weapon of war is a grave crime that must be acknowledged and prosecuted, regardless of which side commits it. Third, that silence and denial compound trauma, while acknowledgement and truth-telling, though painful, allow for healing and learning. The experience of German women in 1945 does not erase German guilt for the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. It does not make Germany the victim of World War II. But it does remind us that within every nation are individuals with their own stories, and that the innocent often suffer most in conflicts they did not create. The 8-year-old girl in Nemmersdorf bore no responsibility for Hitler's crimes, yet she suffered terribly for them. This history also reminds us why justice and discipline in warfare matter so much. The Western Allies, though imperfect, maintained systems that treated assaults as crimes. This was not merely for the benefit of German civilians, but for the moral integrity of their own forces. When armies abandon justice, they create not only victims but perpetrators, men who must live with what they have done. The legacy of 1945 lives on in Germany today. Memorials to the suffering of German civilians during the war are now more common, though still controversial. Museums like the Documentation Center for Displacement, Expulsion, and Reconciliation in Berlin try to tell this story within its full context, acknowledging both the suffering of Germans and its causes in Nazi aggression. This is a difficult balance, but a necessary one. For historians, this period offers crucial lessons about the importance of preserving difficult histories. For decades, this story was suppressed or denied. Only through the painstaking work of researchers, the bravery of survivors willing to speak, and the opening of archives has the truth emerged. Every delay in acknowledging truth is a delay in healing and learning. The women who survived 1945 showed remarkable resilience. They rebuilt their lives in shattered cities, raised children in impossible circumstances, and eventually helped create the stable, democratic Germany that exists today. Their strength should not obscure their suffering, but it should be recognized. They endured the worst of humanity and still chose to build rather than remain broken. Today, sexual violence in conflict remains a global problem. From Bosnia to Rwanda to Syria, women continue to be targeted as weapons of war. The international community has developed better legal frameworks to address these crimes, including the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court, which explicitly recognizes sexual violence as a war crime and crime against humanity. This progress exists partly because survivors from many conflicts, including German women from 1945, eventually told their stories. The moral of this history is not simple or comfortable. It requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. Germany started a war of annihilation that killed tens of millions. The Soviet Union suffered catastrophically under Nazi invasion. Soviet soldiers committed widespread atrocities against German civilians. German women suffered terribly for crimes they largely did not commit. All of these statements are true, and wrestling with their coexistence is essential for understanding the full horror of World War II. As we move further from these events, it becomes easier to view them with historical perspective, rather than political bias. The Cold War framework that forced this story into propaganda battles is gone. We can now see it for what it was: a human tragedy on an enormous scale, one that emerged from the poisonous combination of total war, genocidal ideology, and the collapse of military discipline. The story of what happened to German women when the Red Army arrived is nightmare fuel, as the title suggests. But it is also history that must be remembered, not to assign blame to contemporary nations that did not exist then, not to minimize the Holocaust, not to rehabilitate Nazism, but simply because it happened, because millions suffered, and because forgetting serves no one. The women of Nemmersdorf, of Berlin, of countless towns and villages across Eastern Germany deserved better than they got, both during the war and in the decades of silence that followed. Their stories are now part of the historical record, told not to fuel hatred but to remind us of the true costs of war, the importance of justice even in conflict, and the resilience of those who survive the unthinkable. They are stories of nightmare, yes, but also of survival, and that survival matters. If you found this story powerful and want to learn more about the untold histories of World War II, subscribe to the channel. We're committed to bringing you the full truth of history, the parts that are difficult and the parts that are rarely discussed. Leave a comment with your thoughts and hit that like button to help these important stories reach more people. History is not just about the battles, it's about the people who lived through them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.